Good evening. I am Karen Taylor, Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, and I'm so pleased to welcome you here this evening to our second landmark lecture, which is part of the Labour, Literature and Landmark Lecture Series. And we would like to thank you all for attending this evening. We are so pleased to present this series of landmark lectures in partnership with the New York Landmarks Conservancy, and I would like to express our appreciation for their help and support. For those of you who may be less familiar with the General Society, a brief introduction. We were founded in 1785 by 22 artisans. We are a non-profit organization, and today our 236-year-old organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life of the people of the City of New York through our educational and cultural programs. They include our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, our John M. Mossman Lock Collection, our 200-year-old General Society Library, and our nearly 200-year-old lecture series, of which, of course, tonight's talk is part of. At the conclusion of tonight's talk, there will be a short 10 to 15 minute Q&A, but you are welcome to submit typed questions at any point through the lecture, and of course, at the conclusion of the lecture. And we would ask that you use the Q&A section rather than raising your hand. I also want to mention that in the chat section, you will find a link to the wonderful book that's going to be discussed tonight, Material Transfers. To introduce our speaker and the landmark lecture this evening, I'm so pleased to welcome back our curator for this series, our curator for the past 8 years, Lisa Easton, a partner in the New York-based architecture and historic preservation firm, Easton Architects. Lisa, I'm so pleased that you can be here this evening.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Over the past year, I've taken the opportunity to look at my community and the places familiar to me and really look and listen at what makes them special and familiar and interesting and tangible. The built environment is enriched by the combination and coexistence of the new and the old, the exemplary and the ordinary, the riches of success and the struggles of poverty. Preservation provides the opportunity to listen and learn from the stories told by the buildings and the generations who have built and occupied them, which informs the sense of place that surrounds us. Herbert Mouchamp once said, "A building does not have to be an important work of architecture to become a first-rate landmark. Landmarks are not created by architects. They are fashioned by those who encounter them after they are built." The essential feature of a landmark is not its design, but the place it holds in a city's memory. Compared to the place it occupies in social history, a landmark's artistic qualities are incidental. I'm honored to be a part of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen's 2021 Labor, Literature, and Landmarks Lecture Series. Over the past 8 years, I've curated the lecture series, and I've encountered extraordinary individuals who have helped shape our view of historic preservation. This year's landmark series focuses on the landmarks with a small l that impact the lives and different cultures, eras, and communities. Tonight, I am proud to introduce our second lecturer in this year's series, Françoise Bollack. Françoise is an architect and principal of Françoise Bollack Architects with over 40 years of experience in architectural design, historic preservation, adaptive reuse, and interior design. In addition to her private practice, Françoise is an adjunct associate professor of historic preservation at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Historic Preservation, and an accomplished author of several books, one of which will be showcased in this evening's presentation. Sorry about that. Materials transfers, metaphor, craft, and place in contemporary architecture is an examination of the connections between contemporary expression in architecture and traditional materials and forms. Françoise's selection of 18 contemporary projects from around the world share the interpretation of traditional forms and materials, all impacting human interaction and expressing cultural patterns. He weaves together continuities between our condition now and earlier practices in building technology and form. I look forward to the presentation, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you Françoise Bollack.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen, and here it is. Okay, can you see the image? Yes. So thank you very much for inviting me. It would be really great to be able to give this talk in the magnificent library space at the General Society, and I hope we'll do that very soon. But we're doing this virtually, which is also quite interesting. So I'm going to talk about this book tonight, which in a way is a sequel to the previous book that I published on a sort of related subject, which was called Old Buildings, New Forms, New Directions in Architectural Transformations. And it's part of my interest in finding ways of relating our new architecture to historic architecture in a way that is fresh and reconstructs and reclaims architectural procedures, reclaims methods of working, reclaims ways of proceeding through a project, which in a way were sidelined or sometimes eliminated by the schism, what I call the schism in modern architecture. So this is an effort, this and the previous book are an effort to reweave, in a sense, the fabric of architectural practice, reconnect to our architectural culture, while at the same time weaving into it the strands of modern architecture. So it's not this an either or, it's really trying to reweave the whole fabric. So now what is this particular book about? Material transfers, metaphor, craft, and place in contemporary architecture. In a nutshell, it is about the creative possibilities of imitation, duplication, replication, and recall. All these procedures were made taboo by modern architecture. You could not imitate something. You were supposed to invent everything every day. Any historical allusion was taboo. And so architectural practice got impoverished, and it also got somewhat hypocritical because it's impossible to invent something every day. So I'm proposing that we should recover these procedures and reclaim them for ourselves. Now, what's interesting is that, oh, how do I move the slide? Is that in the 60s, while architects were living in a straitjacket of their own making, visual artists were experimenting to great results. We're experimenting with imitation, with duplication, with finding inspiration in other media and appropriating these other images. So here we have Andy Warhol, Double Elvis of 1963. Now it's interesting to examine what happens here, because you will find these procedures alive in the work of the architects that you're going to see in a little bit. Because I think that it's interesting to see the whole artistic production of the period whole. You know, architecture, visual images, visual inspiration doesn't stop with architecture or sculpture or drawing. There's a back and forth between all these media. So what's happening here? What's happening here is that the origin image of this is an 8x10 glossy, which is an image of a movie still, promotional image. And Warhol takes this 8x10 image, blows it up to 83 by 53 inches, reproduces it in a different medium, which is a silk screen ink, and then puts it on canvas, and then slides the image to do a double image. And then he makes 23 of them. So the mind boggles at the iteration of duplications and sort of the question that it raises about, you know, the author, the role of the author, the place of the author, the importance of the author, who is the author, and the continuation of an image through other media. So the image doesn't stop living the day it stops being an ad for this movie, but it continues living in a different way. So it extends the life of this image and the life of this, this idea. Now, at the same time, Liechtenstein, 1963, does his very famous Drowning Girl. And here again, the inspiration is in a very ordinary publication. This is a pulp publication, and it's the cover of this pulp publication, which is, it's a DC Comics, and it was done in 1962, and it's called Run for Love. And you see this whole image of this young girl sort of drowning and this guy sort of grabbing the boat. And she says, I don't care if I have a crab, I'd rather sink than call Mal for help. I'm just reading this. And Liechtenstein sort of frames out all the rest of the image, but he does quite a literal copy of this girl's face. I mean, it's a little bit abstracted. The hand is almost a duplication. And here again, it's much bigger. It's a much bigger, it's 67 by 66. And so there's a transfer of the colors are different, the words are different, the image is different, and this lowbrow cartoon, you know, is transformed into a high art image by this procedure. And then we have Via Selmans on the right, and her pink pearl eraser of 1967. Here, this is a three-dimensional object, three-dimensional sculpture, three-dimensional object, which is a replication of a very, very ordinary, everyday object, which is a pink eraser. And here again, it's much bigger. And here again, the artist has spent a tremendous amount of energy in the duplication of this, in the copy of this object. The texture, it's balsa wood, which is very, very light wood, but the texture, the pink texture, and the gray writing, all of that is carefully observed and carefully imitated with a great deal of technical savoir-faire to just arrive at the perfect copy, albeit a different size, of this ordinary object. So artists were absolutely not intimidated by the idea that imitation is a kind of form of non-art, but they grasped the potential, the potential of this procedure as a way to sort of develop their own approaches, maybe to get out of themselves, maybe to find new ways. And it was, as we all know, very, very productive. Now I'm going to look a little bit at similar practices in architectural culture, because in our architectural culture, we have for many years used literal imitation or transformed imitation or replication. And we've also used certain building types, certain known buildings, which have become sort of really important images in architecture to use as inspiration. So the first thing I'm going to look at is the persistence of form. What more persistent than the form of the Pantheon in Rome, which was built in 2nd century AD, with its portico, the sort of flat pediment behind it, and then this very low slung dome over the round room has inspired architects to this day. So here we have on the lower right, the Villa Capra by Palladio in 1567, where he takes this image and then rotates it to provide 4 porticos, and the dome is a slightly different dome, but clearly the Pantheon is an inspiration. And then we have the Pantheon in Stourhead in England by Henry Flitcroft in 1744-46, which is a more literal love letter to the Pantheon in Rome. But there are differences, you know, there are variations. But here again, these copies prolong the life of the original and then reflect themselves on the original and enrich our understanding of it. So this is not an impoverishment, it's actually an enrichment of the culture of a particular building form. And lastly, we have the Jefferson Memorial in Washington by John Russell Pope in 1939-1943, which is a more literal imitation of the Pantheon in Rome. It has the correct number of columns, and the low slung dome is very, very clearly, very, very lovingly imitated. Of course, there is a reason why Pope would want to imitate the Pantheon in Rome. It's a nod to Jefferson's architecture, Jefferson himself, because Jefferson had used the image of the Pantheon for the library at the University of Virginia. So there's a kind of a double reference with this. But all these imitations are a form of homage, a form of love, really, for what the original building represents for these architects. Now I'm going to look at what I call archetypal forms. In other words, forms that architects choose because they are meaningful to them, and then reincorporate them into the architecture. And here we have the Santa Maria Novella Church in Florence by Leone Battista Alberti of 1448 to 1470. And this is actually the completion of an earlier building. And the way the building that Alberti found is represented on this sketch on the upper right. The building was finished for the lower part. It had a series of blind arches, which still exist, executed in contrasting marble colors, and of 3 Gothic arches, one of them being the center door, and then Gothic arches which were framing niches in which were the sarcophagi of donors to the church. So Alberti was asked to complete the church. And what he does is that he takes the image of a temple, the image of a Roman temple. This is 4 columns, it's a portico with a pediment. He takes this image and builds it on top of what he constructs as sort of a new plinth, and then he enlarges the center door. But this is, I think, an extraordinary intervention, because it's not a building, it's an image of a building, it's a drawing of a building. Like, nobody is walking through this center bay, nobody is walking behind these columns. It's almost just 2-dimensional, it's just a drawing. But this is a drawing that he proposes as the way forward for Renaissance architecture. So it's a manifesto. And this is just a print, and I think it's a very powerful procedure. And I think it has a lot, these procedures have a lot to offer, as you will see later, to architecture now and to preservation in particular. Now I'm going to, and then we have, so this is all about taking something that is known and reproducing it something that is known in the past and reproducing it in the present and developing a whole new architecture out of that. And this is certainly what Greek Revival architects did. They looked at Greece, they looked at Greek precedents, in particular Doric precedents. And they used these models in a new architecture, sometimes in a very, very correct rendition, as in this building on 13th Street, which is still standing and is now an apartment building. But also sometimes in very, very modest vernacular buildings. I could build this garage in Maine on the right, which is a circa 1850, where the style becomes, the rendition itself becomes very inventive. So on the upper left, you have a very correct imitation of a certain temple in Greece. But on the right, you have an architect, or more likely a carpenter, who takes elements of this architecture that are meaningful to him, and then reproduces them in a very free composition. So what we have here is a procedure by which an architecture of stone, you know, Greek architecture is an architecture of stone, it's an architecture of mass. Stones are piled on top of each other. An architecture of stone is translated into an architecture of sheathing and carpentry and articulation in a completely different culture of wood. And that transformation is very interesting because it then allows the carpenters who built these buildings, they knew how to build them, and then they had models. And the whole richness of this new vernacular comes from the transformation of a model into a new way of building. On the lower left, this is earlier, this is in 1830. It's in Helsinki, and it's a summer house. And this is actually, I think, an extraordinary building, which is this sort of willful collage of the grand in the form of this porch, and the vernacular in the form of this truncated house on the left, and then there's this urn on the top. So it's a very knowing design. Carl Ludwig Engel was by no means a vernacular architect. He built half of the capital of Finland. So this is a little game, you know, with this new medium. And then on the lower right, we have a more vernacular rendition in this wonderful little friendly capital in Ovid, New York. It's called Papa Bear, Mama Bear, and Baby Bear. And there are 3 municipal buildings. There are 3 state buildings. One of them is the courts. The other one is, I think, the archives. And the one on the right is a building for the lawyers. So then we have, following the same lines, we have Gothic Revival, where again, an architecture of stone becomes an architecture of wood and an architecture of thin clad surfaces. So, and again, it's an architecture that's built by carpenters. So we have in Carpenter Gothic, of course. So we have here on the left a little chapel in Raleigh, North Carolina, where, you know, the quadrufold window at the top tells a Gothic story. And you have these words in the sentence that say, I am a Gothic building, but then everything else is free and local. And on the right, we have Trinity Parish Chapel in Southport, Connecticut, 1871 and 1872, where you have these vestigial flying buttresses, which are here, they're also on the right here. Of course, there is no stone wall to be buttressed. This is all kind of a recalling the words of the sentence that made a Gothic sentence. And lastly, and very importantly, we have cast iron architecture, which is a really important step towards modern architecture. And what's interesting about it is that this new technology of cast iron allowed merchants and architects and builders to choose these repetitive elements and to build facades very quickly and rather cheaply. So they could, you could take this arch, which if you were to do it in stone, would be a very expensive thing to do. You have to carve the capitals, you have to carve the keystone, you have to lay the stones and all that. But if it's in cast iron, you can build it quickly, and then you can build 50 of them. And what's important about that is that what comes under the radar, this is an incredible invention. First of all, the curtain wall is an incredible invention. And second of all, modularity, which was a key aspect of modern architecture, is invented, or reinvented rather, by cast iron architecture. And this incredible new idea that would have been extremely frightening if it hadn't come under the guise of a fully decorated building, just slipped under the radar. And Philip Johnson acknowledges this in a preface to a book about cast iron, says this is one of the most important things in modern architecture, this invention of modularity, and it came in with cast iron architecture. So those are the basic sources, the basic models that existed for the notion of imitation or replication or recall or duplication. And now we're going to look at new work. So the first, I like to sort of categorize things so I can sort of put things that seem to be similar to each other, buildings that seem to have something to say to each other in a same category. This first category is called old forms, new materials. And as this diagram tries to talk about, it is about the mixing of known forms, like in this case, a house form, and then executing it or in new materials. And what comes out of this procedure, which is there's this known image, but you're building it in a way in which you don't expect such a building to be built, and what happens with that. So the first building is the Dairy House in Somerset by an architect called Charlotte Skin-Catlin. It was finished in 2007. And this is where it becomes clear how rich these procedures can be for historic preservation and for dealing with existing additions to existing buildings. So the existing building is this building on the left. The new building is the building on the right. The photograph, if you look at the plan at the top of the slide, the photograph is from the right. So this is the existing building here. The new building is here, and it bridges over this wall here, which is this wall in the picture, towards the hill, and there's a pool that you will see in a little while. And then this opening here in the slide is a stair that allows you to go up to the upper part. And so this building, which looks old, and the brief, as they say in England, was that the program given by the owner was that the building had to look undesigned, which for an architect is a very, very hard thing to do. But what was interesting is that when Charlotte Skin-Catlin came to the site to look at the site before starting to work, this is an agricultural site. She saw wood boards drying with spacers to allow the air to circulate and to allow them to dry. So these were wood boards drying on the estate. And it gave her an idea, which she then executed in the new building. So the walls of the new building would be wood boards, and the space between the wood boards would be rendered in glass. So this is what you see in this building. So at night, it sort of shines like a lantern. So you can enter this way. This is the wall on the left. This is the other side from the previous side. And inside, this is the effect that you get. And so her idea was that since the boards were horizontal, she also wanted the glass to be horizontal. And since the boards had a smooth side and a rough side. She wanted her new boards to also have a smooth side and rough side. So the boards are smooth inside, they're rough outside, and the glass is smooth inside and it's rough outside. And there are three places where the glass is put on end so you can actually see through it when you're sitting on the loo or brushing your teeth. But what's just as when he did the double Elvis or V.S. Hellman's did her pink eraser, there's a lot of attention paid to technical issues involved in this copying. There were enormous technical issues to be resolved here. For example, the tolerance for wood is a completely different tolerance. The wood moves with temperature, but glass doesn't. So to resolve this joint of the wood and the glass was also very tricky. So there are a lot of technical issues. Once the copy, so the image of the copy gets executed, there are a lot of technical issues to make this copy perfect along the lines that the architect wants it to be perfect. This is actually one of the most extraordinary buildings I've ever seen. It's just really magical to be inside. And it's quite wonderful outside as well. It's also about reflections. There's this sort of piece of water that reflects the house and the glass. But it is interesting when you think about, building a barn. In general, barns are pretty opaque things. They're supposed to protect what is kept inside. But here, the glass makes it visually porous and transforms it into something completely different. So this is really quite a building. Next is a building in Germany, in Kanzem an der Saar. It's a guest house and orangery. So this is the project. This was an existing building built in the 18th century. This is a wine estate. So this was the building for the people who owned the vineyards. And these two buildings have been added. So this is the plan here. Here you have the original old building. This is a vineyard at the back. And this is the two new buildings. This is the road. And there's also a railroad that goes here. And here, as in the previous project, and this also has tremendous implications for the notion of place, which is in the title of the book. The materials come from the place itself. And the design of the building also roots it in its place as it looks modest, it looks agricultural. So this is a little guest house. And it's made of rammed earth. So you see all the layers of the rammed earth. And what is really kind of wonderful about this is the fact that it is extremely abstract. So it has this feeling of being absolutely unquestionable. There's almost no design involved in this. This is a house. And then on the other side is kind of the opposite. So this is massive and this is articulated. So there's this essay in this new project between these two modes of construction. But the building on the right is the one that interests me in particular. It was inspired in part by Trulli. There's buildings in the vineyards, which the people in German call Trulli, using the name that is given to them in southern Italy. And they're made of local materials picked up in the place, and they have these sort of basic sort of forms. And so this is the same thing. The sand is local, and it goes into this mixture with a very, very little bit of concrete and water. And then it is taken between two solid forms, which you see here on the left, upper left. So this is a form, this is a form, and you pour this mixture, and then you tap it and tap it and tap it and tap it. So it's wonderful because you look at this building and it sort of carries the history of its own making. You can see layers that are a little bit darker, layers that are a little thinner, layers that are more irregular. So it kind of displays its history. The wall is also quite alive because when it rains, it gets darker. And so this is an architecture that's very, very environmentally responsive. It's very local. And it's also, the owners of this project were very, as they are vintners, and therefore very aware of the value of the manual labor of the people who deal with the vineyards. We're very aware of the value of the people who made this building. They said they are the authors of this building. They're the first authors, that was their expression. So I think there's a lot of depth to these ways of working. And I also think that it offers a lot of possibilities for when working with existing buildings to work both with traditional techniques, traditional building forms, but at the same time abstract modern forms in a way that's holistic. So, and last in this category is 16 West 21st Street by Maurice Ajmi, completed in 2009. This is a building that's in the Ladies Mile Historic District. Some of you may know it. It's on the south side of the street. The Ladies Mile Historic District was built mostly after the 1893 Columbia exhibition. And so the buildings are mostly light colored masonry, light colored brick, light colored granite, light colored limestone. And so for Maurice Ajmi, his first decision was that the building had to be white, but it also had to be modern. And so what more modern material is there than glass? Except he didn't want to use glass the way it's used now, like a sort of a saran wrap, but he wanted to use in a way that echoed the historic buildings. So when you see this new building now, which is in the middle of the slide, everything you see is glass. The columns are slumped glass. These lintels are glass. This is glass. Everything is glass. And it's interesting because it actually blends very well, as the Landmarks Commission likes to say. It blends very well with the other buildings, but it has a quality which is really hard to render in photographs because when the light penetrates the glass, it acts completely differently from the way light penetrates or doesn't penetrate masonry. So here again, as in the dairy house that I showed you first, we have, or as in, for example, the Greek Revival model that I showed earlier, you have an architecture of masonry, which is the historic architecture in historic district, which is an architecture of weight, an architecture of massive forces that is replicated as a cladding into which light penetrates. So there's a lot of richness between these two things. So the building form is based on this, but it adds to the model in many different, in textural ways and in architectural ways as well. This was a mock-up they did. You see on these sides, they printed a pattern of a brick pattern. So here again, the architect paid a lot of attention to the modalities of this replication, to the technical aspects of it and to the visual aspects of it. My second category, there are three categories. My second category is new forms, old materials. And it is what happens when an absolutely obviously modern form is built with traditional materials, either with traditional materials or with an overlay of traditional materials. And the first project is an older project of 1967, 1970 by Alison and Peter Smithson, and it's the garden building at St. Hildas in Oxford. And here we have you could say dumb, brutalist building with ribbon windows and concrete spandrels and concrete vertical columns, which is overlaid with a sort of a half timber screen, which kind of mediates, which softens the sort of undecorated, rather ordinary, to use their word, form of their building. And what's interesting is that in that period, of course, architects were not supposed to imitate or to have references, but they were quite forceful in revealing these references in nautical and architectural design. And these three references were what they said they were thinking about when they designed this building. The first is a painting by Conrad Wirtz, The Annunciation of 1410, where I think the most important and interesting thing is the separation of the carpentry support and the wall, and in particular, this support of this kind of articulation here. And of course, the obvious reference is the half timber construction of Northern Europe. This is a building in Marburg, in Germany. And a lot of these buildings in half timber exist in England, but the Smithsons had buildings in Marburg in their books. And then there's the timber bridge at Magdalene's Boys' School in Oxford, which they specifically reference for its articulated screen quality. So they were consciously looking at these examples and using references to these examples to make this building, which is a new modern building, which essentially is a universal modernity, aspired to universality, which is of course a building that has nothing to do with the place, or design that has nothing to do with the place, but to make it belong to the place in its material overlay. So this is a close-up on the left, which is a more recent picture. You know that because the window on the left has been changed to an aluminum window for those of us who are obsessed with windows. And here on the right, you can see the effect, the softening effect of this screen over the rather abstract facade design. Then we have the Dominus Winery in Yountville in California by Herzog and de Meuron in 1995, 1997. And this is an absolutely abstract, modern shape. It's very linear. It's very horizontal. It of course, it has no ornament, and it has very, very few incidents. So it couldn't be more abstract. It also changes very much in different lighting condition. And the wall of this building is made with what's called gabions. And gabions are a traditional, very, very, I would say inexpensive, very vernacular way of dealing with earth retaining works. It's used in civil engineering. It was used in the Middle Ages for war engineering. And it consists of crates of lattice made with metal rods, which are then filled in with rocks of bigger size or smaller size or different sizes. And what's interesting in the case of the Dominus Winery is that they took the rocks, the basalt rocks, from the place. So here again, you have a local material which has not been moved very far, so it's environmentally responsible. And it's also of the color of the place. And that I think is a really interesting aspect of it. And so Herzog and de Meuron take this and then manipulate the size of the stones and build a wall that is porous to light. And so it breathes, and so it absorbs heat during the day and it heats the space during the night. So the spaces inside are of a pretty constant temperature. But they also refer to this as a woven architecture, the fact that these crates are woven. So there's a handcrafted quality to this, as there was to the previous buildings that I've shown you, in particular the winery and the dairy. The hand is involved with this. So whereas in modern architecture, the reference was always to industry, in these procedures, the reference is always to craft and to making, which of course makes sense because because winemaking is an intensely local and intensely manual operation. And last in this category is, is the Vardency Center in Ribe, Denmark, by Dorthe Mandrup, which was completed in 2017. This is a fantastic building. It's a very beautiful, elongated, abstract, modern shape, and it's executed in thatch. And so, which is a technique that is very much still used in Northern Europe. And it's actually an addition to a complex that existed already. So building in red here existed, and this existed as well. And she wrapped this new building around the existing buildings. And the roof is thatch, the walls are thatch. I mean, in traditional thatched buildings in Northern Europe and Eastern Europe, only the roof is thatched. So she invents a new sort of use for this material because it's now the whole building is thatched. And also the eaves of the building are very, very sharp, as you see on the right. So they had to invent different details. So this imitation, this imitative procedure gives a new life to an existing technology. It expands its reach, and it makes the craftspeople confront themselves with new ways of doing it while keeping up their old strategies. So I think that aspect of it is very important. Here you have on the left a close-up of the eave. So the underside of the eave is thatch, and then the wall is thatch. And of course, photographs cannot replicate the kind of sound. If you walk under this eave, the thatch is very insulating. So it's kind of very quiet space. And it also has a specific smell. So it's a very rich environment, which is both oral and visual, and it is olfactory. So it's a very rich architecture. And here again, it is local. The thatch is procured locally. And it refers to buildings. This is a photograph I took of a building that's nearby. And it refers to buildings in the area. So it offers connections to an architecture that exists. It keeps it relevant and fresh. And it also brings modern architecture in conversation with it. And I think it's an important procedure. My last category is mimesis in defense of imitation. So here you have a building and maybe a copy of it, but in maybe a slightly different way. And then some sort of penetrations between them somehow. So the first building I'm going to discuss is Frack, Fonds Régionaux d'Art Contemporain in Dunkirk in France, by Lacaton and Vassal in 2009. That was a competition, and it was finished in 2015. And as we all know, Lacaton and Vassal have just won the Pritzker Architecture Prize. So this is the original building, and it was the object of a competition, which they won. And the program was that the program called for the architects to adaptively reuse this building for use as an art gallery, to show art, to have art events, but also to store art and to have lectures. So this building, which essentially consists, the interior space is exactly as the exterior space. It's a huge, enormous hall. And when they saw that, they said, we can't do that. It's a beautiful space. We're going to stuff it full of stuff, and it's going to lose its drama. So they just couldn't see themselves doing it. So what they did is they duplicated it. So this is essentially left alone. And they duplicated it, but in a different set of material, in different architectural expression. So here, as in Greek Revival architecture, you have an original building, you have an original image, which is weighty, which is masonry, and then it gets duplicated in a vernacular way. It gets duplicated in a very, very light material. This is plastic. It's insulating plastic. It's polycarbonate. That's the word I was looking for. In terms of design, the shape is the shape and the size of the original building, but the design is very different. It has no centrality, no hierarchies, no monumentality to the openings. It's just the facts, ma'am, sort of thing. It's very modest, it's very inexpressive in many ways, and it doesn't try to compete with the existing buildings. So here again, we have a strategy that is very rich in terms of dealing with existing buildings. So this is an aerial view with the existing building, the new building, and the hall, the existing building is kept. And then the new building is, the roof abuts it, but there's a sort of a big slot that allows you to see the facade of the existing building so that it's still perceived in the round. And then inside of that, they stuff the whole new building full of functions. So you see on the left that the existing building is left alone, and the sort of dialogue between the drama and the power of this existing building, which they haven't neatened up, thankfully, and the sort of lightness and almost ephemerality of the new building is actually very rich. This is a stair with this polycarbonate exterior wall that you see. And this is it at night. So this is still, operates as a sort of massive, rather mute building. And here's the new building, and they sort of stand aside in studied sort of disinterest with each other, which I think is very poetic. This is Crystal Houses by MVRDV, and it opened in 2016 for Chanel, and then they did a later slight renovation for Hermes. This is in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. This used to be a road. Now, in terms of historic preservation, there are things that are open to discussion. This used to be a row of 3 of exactly this building. So this continued itself at this cornice line. These 2 buildings were demolished, and the design was extended so that they could deliver to what was then Chanel a higher commercial floor and second floor. But they duplicated the original design, but extended it. But then imitated it in glass block in the lower part. So this is clearly a tour de force, which is very. I sound a bit uncomfortable because I think it's open to question in terms of the preservation strategy, but in terms of the if you forget about the fact that these old buildings were demolished for a second, and if you accept the fact that you have to introduce some modernity in a high-class shopping street, then I think this is a strategy that's worth looking at. And everything in this facade, at the lower part of the facade, is glass. The window frames are glass. This is glass. Everything is glass. The door frame is glass. It is truly a tour de force. So this was the facade before. You see these 2 buildings are lower. And then at some point, they transitioned from the glass to the masonry at the top. This is something that the reviewing commission asked them to do. And here again, there's a high degree of craft involved in this, the research necessary to develop the sealant between the terracotta brick and the glass brick, which again have two different coefficients of movement, and the sealant between the brick and between the brick and the glass window frame. This is the glass window frame. That required a tremendous amount of research, both in lab coats, in laboratory environment, but also in a way turn the construction site into a laboratory itself. So this is a view from the inside, which is quite magical, actually, when you see from the inside this transparency, and the joints become part of the architecture in a different way. And this is a close-up on the inside. And then here you see them pouring test bricks. So this is a very crafted architecture. Look at this window frame, which is in glass. I mean, I think they must have enjoyed sort of doing this Luc Mano hands sort of thing. And it is quite pleasurable to be in. And my last building is 85 Rue Championnet in Paris by Chartier-Corbasson in 2017. This is a very inventive, very interesting project. This was a site in which there was no building. This is on a street where the neighboring buildings are built in late Haussmann period. So they're Haussmann buildings. They're limestone. They have, cast iron balconies. They have punch windows. They have a rusticated base at the bottom. Haussmann buildings. That's how they work. And first of all, there was no budget to build such a building, but they wanted to establish a continuity with the existing architecture, but still have a modern building. So this is this tension between continuity and modernity. And so what they did is they took a picture of the adjoining building and then reproduced it on panels. So these panels have the photograph of the existing building on the right, and they open in a different pattern than the existing windows open. So there's a kind of a sort of call and response between the old building and the new building. And behind these movable panels is a dumb modern building with floor-to-ceiling sliding glass doors and very narrow jeweled balconies. So this is what you see. So you see this integration of the building in the architecture, integration and non-integration, but I think it works. And so the modern building behind these shutters, and then the image of the old building. Of course, the shutters are never closed, but they took a photograph with it closed to see how the photograph works. So, and also what's interesting is, as you're going to see, is that these panels are perforated. So a certain amount of these pixels of the photograph are perforated. So you see a little bit of when they're closed over a room which is lit inside, there's a little porosity of this light. So the facade is really quite alive with the inside and the outside sort of being porous to each other. So they did a tremendous amount of material research. This is the first try when they printed this on a concrete panel, but the concrete panel ended up being too heavy, both for the structure, because it made the structure needed to be more solid and therefore more expensive, but also too heavy to move with the hinges. So they hit on the idea of using a material called trespa, which is a very cheap material that is a wood agglomerate material that is used for road signs. And so they printed the pictures on it and then informed the drilling machines with how many of those could be cut through so that the material would still retain its integrity. So this is a section, this is inside, this is a little Juliet balcony in glass, and these are the movable panels. And this is in plan. And this is a section of the building with a penthouse at the top. This is affordable housing, by the way. And this is it seen from the inside. You see how you can see through. And so the panels are fairly narrow, so they create a texture for the facade, which is welcome on the otherwise flat modern facade. So this is the end of my talk, and I'd be very happy to entertain questions.
Françoise.
Yes.
That was fantastic. I mean, the projects are just absolutely fascinating. So, I mean, the book just looks incredible. So, many congratulations on that.
Thank you. Can we go back to the last slide that shows the back of the book?
Of course. Well, sorry, you have to do that, of course.
Oh, I have to do that?
Yes, you have to do that.
Okay, I did it. Okay, did it. Okay. So I'd be happy to answer questions if there are questions.
Right. Okay. Well, we do have a few questions, so I will start. Unless Victoria, do you want to say anything?
Oh well, Françoise, I mean, fascinating. A couple of things. Taking us on this tour, you know, it makes you not. There are enough reasons to miss travel, and this just completely added to the list. I can't wait to explore.
That's right.
I was thinking as you were speaking that, you know, again, as our audience knows, I've said it so many times before, you know, I'm a native New Yorker. I derive so much pleasure from buildings and what surrounds us. And especially during this past year, it's provided such a sense of stability and beauty. And so again, thank you for adding another dimension to that with your lecture.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes. So how has your background in the historic preservation influenced your examination of the conflux of contemporary and traditional forms of architectural expression?
Should I maybe stop share so people can see me?
Yes, of course, if you want to. Yes.
Okay,
yes.
I'm gonna do that. Okay, I'm doing that. So well, I think, you know, I mean, my interest is really to, I mean, I love old buildings. I've always loved old buildings. And when I went to architecture school, we were not supposed to love old buildings. We were supposed to, I went to architecture school in the 60s. We were supposed to, you know, it was all Le Corbusier and Neutra and all those things. And so I've spent my life reconciling these things. I've spent my life saying you can have both at the same time. You know, you don't have to choose. You can love old buildings and do the right thing by them, but you can also love new buildings and do the right thing by them. It's not, you know, it's not a cut. So both the previous book and this book really try to deal with this, having it both ways, to deal with being able to operate in the modern world and be able to deal with modern forms and building modern buildings, but at the same time, practicing in a way that doesn't exclude old buildings. So so this particular book is really about looking at traditional forms, you know, the barn, the house, you know, the loft building, looking at traditional forms and saying, what can we do with this form that brings it into the present, not as a precious old object, but as something that we build in a contemporary way, and not in a snarky way either, you know. So I think that's the reason, that's what interests me in this. And somebody asked me a question in a previous lecture I gave, said, you know, when architects imitate, it can really turn quickly to silliness. And the example this architect gave was Philip Johnson, the building that Philip Johnson did for Pittsburgh Plate Glass, PPG, in Pittsburgh, which is a mirrored glass building that tries to emulate Gothic forms, and which is a horrible building. And I think that the difference is the architects who did the buildings in this book have really a purpose. It's not just a sort of a kind of a dare. It's their purpose is to really do a building that will fit in that place in terms of cultural references and in terms of materials and in terms of the craft. The fact that so that the building is rooted in the place. And when imitation or duplication or replication can help you do that, then it becomes a good ally. Does it make sense?
Right, absolutely. Now you've probably addressed the next question in what you've said already, but perhaps there's something else you want to add. What inspired you to engage in this research and pursuits?
Well, it's the idea. I mean, I think that one of the issues I think that exist, and I'm sure there are people in the audience who are very familiar with these issues. One of the issues that exist in architectural practice now is that people tend to think of preservation architecture as one thing, and architecture or contemporary architecture as another. And I think that's a disastrous approach. There's architecture good, or architecture bad, and that's the end of the story. So I'm trying to get past this idea that there is one way to approach preservation projects, which has a certain set of rules. I'm trying to say, what I'm trying to bring back into practice is the fact that you can be respectful and you can of older buildings or older urban or agrarian context, and you can be respectful in different ways. Than you can use different procedures. You can be respectful, but also be contemporary. And this contemporary doesn't have to be an in-your-face, mirror glass, atrium. You can reinvent old procedures and sort of reintroduce them with different materials. And to me, that's a kind of a way in which we can deal with being people of our time, like people love to say, and at the same time, keeping in the running older forms, older practices, extend their life because we're reusing them in a different way. So that's what drives me.
Right, well, I think from the examples that you've showed us, you've illustrated that very well in your book. And that sort of leads on to the next question. What was your selection criteria for the 18 projects for inclusion in the book? And I also want to mention to our audience, there is a link in the chat to purchase the book, if that would be something you would be interested in doing. And then to finish this question, and what other examples did you explore that might be worthy of the next edition?
Well, my criteria for selection of buildings in the book, it's hard to say. I have, first of all, I don't talk about a building that I haven't seen. The only building I haven't seen is in Japan, and I'm not going to Japan. I don't like to fly. So I have to see the building, and it has to resonate. I mean, that's the only thing. Sometimes I go see a building, I expect to like it, and I don't. And so I don't include it. And sometimes I go to see a building and I'm expecting that I'm very likely not to like it, and I like it. So it's very emotional. You have to look at it, and it has to sing. It's like music in a way. I mean, if you listen to music, it has to move you, and I don't think there's any other criterion than that. So it has to be well. It has to be, and it also has to have some. It has to have a design integrity, meaning that the and I interview the architects in general. I mean, most of the buildings I've interviewed the architects. The architect has to have carried out a certain idea with a certain amount of conviction. I saw a building, I went to see a building in Poland that I fully expected to include, and it was very crudely executed, and I just didn't include it. So, you know, it has to be well built, it has to be well thought out, it has to be designed with conviction, and the idea has to be kind of whole, if you know what I mean. It's like, it can't just be, you know, it can't just be thrown together because it was an idea that looked good that morning, like the PPG building in Pittsburgh. It can't just be an idea that's, you know, in your face because the architect thought that would get them published. So it has to really have a sort of depth. It's a very unscientific process. It's beyond unscientific. So, I mean, you know, I think that there are a number of buildings that I didn't put in the book because they were, first of all, you don't want to go on and on, but also because they lack that quality of density of design, you know, that I think makes a building better than another building. I'm actually now working on the history of additive architecture.
I'm sorry, of what architecture?
I'm actually now, since you were asking about the next book, I'm working on a history of additive architecture, starting in the Middle Ages. So it's a different subject.
Oh, okay. Well, that's well. We'll look forward to welcoming you back when you address that. Now, this is a question from Kirk Bent. Now, all the buildings that you have illustrated tonight, they're all included in your book. Would that be a correct assumption?
Yes, of course. Yes, and there's more of them. There's more buildings. There are more buildings. Yes,
because I believe that there's 16 projects in total, and that was from Kirk Bent.
I think that's it.
And so we certainly have a number of comments. This is from Amisha Hunter, and she thanks you, Françoise, for this amazing presentation. And she so appreciates seeing the examples and your intelligent and insightful commentary.
Thank you.
Dawn Ladd, again, not a question, but a huge brava. Incredible images and such a fresh perspective, and I you know, I completely second that, because it probably, as you say, it shouldn't have to be a new perspective, but it really is a new perspective. Right. You're shaking up things. You're taking the traditional and modern and showing how they are a wonderful fusion. Mm-hmm. And Caroline Zalaski adds, what about she talks about the wit and the irony of some of these buildings. And what do you feel about that? Because it did seem that the buildings were quite witty. Many of them were quite witty.
Well, yes. I mean, I think that like the last building, for example, is, and these architects talked literally about continuities. I think the last building, I'm not sure I would say wit, but I think to me there's a love of the old buildings, and a love of wanting to keep them in the running, if I can use this expression, wanting to keep them relevant, and so I think that there's a, if that's, you know, the wit, if there's a general sort of commentary on these old buildings through their reactivation through these new practices, which is very very gentle and and it's not snarky. It's always saying, you know, look at this old thing, we love it, we want it to continue existing in our own time. And I find that absolutely wonderful and also provocative. But I think what is also, to me, very important to think about is the craft aspect of these buildings. And by craft, I don't mean this in any nostalgic sort of way. I mean this in a way in which it's important to explore contemporary ways in which buildings are whole in so many different ways, meaning they're whole in the way they're made from materials that come from the place, the people who make them have skin in the game, so to speak. And to think about manufacturing, hand making, to think about people making something and paying attention to something, how it is made, literally. Even the building by Maurice Ajmi on West 21st Street pays a lot of attention, even though these things are made in a factory, pays a lot of attention to the craft of making this glass. So the craft of making, and I think that's a very important different outlook from the modern outlook, which was very much about industrialization. So everybody looked at the Sweets catalog, and you got these things from, I mean, very large buildings, of course, are really manufactured specially, but a lot of that was really in a way, like the cast iron architecture that I showed you, was really celebrating the industrial age. And I think now these buildings try to look at craft, but in a contemporary way. And I think that's important to really think about.
Right, absolutely. I think you like the thatch is a very good example, because it's also been able to be used in a contemporary way and allow the building to breathe. I think that was a wonderful example.
And well, the other thing about thatch and some of these buildings is that thatch needs to be replaced eventually, so it needs to be maintained. So it's not, again, the modern idea that the building is finished, it will always be exactly like that, that the building, so the thatch oxidized. When the building was just finished, this building in Ribe, when the building was just finished, the thatch was golden, the thatch is now grayish. So the building oxidizes over time, and eventually they'll replace the thatch. So the building is a sort of living, breathing life, which involves the maker on a continued basis.
Yeah, that's, yeah.
And even the building materials, the way I look at it, it's also a loyalty thing. These newer buildings have a lot to prove. Some of all of these age-old materials have worked very well, and coming to work in this wonderful building every day that was originally built in 1891, I appreciate the craftsmanship every day and how smartly designed it was. And as I walk about the city, and I do notice energy ratings, these efficiency ratings that, and I don't want to brag, but we got a B, which is very good, because some of the newer buildings, they have a D, and they're all over town. And of course, it's tucked away, you can't really see it, but I spot them. But so much to learn from all that has come before us. So
the Trump Soho Hotel has a D, just so that you know.
Oh, okay. We'll just take a final question, but I have to say, Françoise, we have a lot of lovely comments from like Michael Wise, from Norma Barbici, from Joan Berkowitz, from Inda Senshner. Well, I think everyone from Abby Heller. In fact, I'll read hers because it's a lovely comment. Thank you so much for your architectural exploration of history with modern day. A thoughtful balance in unique and striking forms. Architecture that is cooperative, collaborative, creative. Beautifully put, Abby Heller, very nicely. And this then will be the final question. And it was about one of the buildings in Paris with the Tresbar mesh screens. Is it transparent? And if so, how does it look at night?
It is, yes, some of the holes of the pixels. So here again, there's another version of making. The architect took the picture. They, don't ask me how, they coded it so it could be sent to the cutting machines, the drilling machines, the laser cutters. And then they got formulas from the manufacturer of the material that the reason they liked this material is that the surface is gray, but then, like an eighth of an inch, a 16th of an inch below, the material becomes black. So they could slightly erode the surface and get a black dot, big black dot, and then they could drill through the black dot to get light penetration. So they instructed the machines with how many dots could be perforated through and the material still keep its integrity. And so yes, in answer to the question, there's some porosity to light. So it's like there's these small polka dots that are irregularly spaced. So you do get a little bit of light penetration from the inside when it's night and the spaces are lit, or from the outside in during the day when it's day outside. So there's a little porosity to the light, which is interesting. And again, interesting when you think about the fact that this is a picture of a limestone building, and limestone has no porosity to light. So here again, there's this dialogue between the porosity, the non-porosity of the old model, and the porosity of the new iteration, like in the dairy, the first project that I showed you.
Right. Well, Françoise, thank you so much. That was just a wonderful and such eloquent presentation. And I think you really sort of felt like your emotional response to all the buildings you featured. And to quote you, it was very much about having it both ways. And I think I think you've ignited our enthusiasm for looking at buildings in such different ways, and to look at these new and old projects and how they collaborated together. Victoria, I don't know if you want to say something. And Lisa, is there anything that you would like to add?
Thank you, Karen. Yes, Françoise, thank you. That was fabulous. I was really looking forward to this, and I have to say, it excited me because it talks about architecture. It doesn't just talk about the past. And that I love that you say that you were brought up in the architecture training to really abhor historic structures. And, in my background in my undergrad as well, it was Corbusier or nothing. And
exactly.
as it was, love it. But what you did in this lecture, which for me was so poignant, is that you embraced modernity, and you also respected tradition and the art of craft. And the art of craft is something that dates back to the Pantheon and beyond. But the art of craft and how you build a glass frame for a glass window is just, it's the same. It's the same, right. Different in modern times, that intensity and the need for that technology. So I thought it was great. Thank you. And how appropriate to present this lecture at the General Society, which was created by a bunch of craftsmen. So I just, thank you. It was fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
And we look forward, Françoise, to continuing the discussion here at 20 West 44th Street, and count on us for your next book. So we're waiting. Okay. No pressure, but we're waiting.
You're on. Thank you very much. Thank you all very much for that. And I want to thank the audience for very interesting, thoughtful questions. So I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Right. Oh, François, just before you go, I just want to remind the audience, we'll also send out the link that they can purchase your book, Copy of Material Transfers, and it is available at the Monticelli website. So again, and I want to thank you, the audience. I want to thank again Lisa for her wonderful introduction. I want to mention that our next lecture next week is Architecture as Artistic Autobiography, a guide to historic artists' homes and studios. And that I'm just going to very quickly mention the last two landmark lectures in the series. This is on Tuesday, May 25th. It all began with a portal. Thoughts on the Preservation of Cultural Heritage, and that's with Norma Barbashi. And finally, on June 22nd, we have a landmark lecture with Felicia Mayo. Thank you all for coming tonight. Our great thanks to Françoise once more. Thank you. We look forward to seeing you again. Good night.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.